So hi everyone, I'm Philip. In this one we're going to take a closer look at Leica's M10 Monochrom. I've had this camera now for about 2 years. I'd say it reminds me more of film. It's as if there was a supernatural roll of black and white film in here rather than a digital sensor. So before the M10 Monochrom came out, I was looking at the Leica MA or the MP, and I was planning on shooting black and white film. But once I saw the reviews on the M10 Monochrom, I decided, well, I'm going to get this because the images had so much detail and the tonality of them, it reminded me of film. It's basically, this camera is the closest you'll get to using a digital sensor and still get that film-like look. So we all know the Leica M rangefinders are a bare bones tool. However, this camera does have quite a lot of features on it. Let's take a look at some of them. So all you'll have to do is scroll down to the Leica photos, and then you'll click that, and it will show you a QR code, and you can scan that with your iPhone or iPad, and then click on the Leica photos there, and it will automatically turn it on. So the phone will be ready to connect up to your iPhone or iPad. You can then transfer your photographs over into the Leica Photos app. So in the latest firmware update, you'll have perspective control, and you turn that on by going into the main menu and clicking on Capture Assistance. And then you scroll all the way down to perspective control and make sure it's turned on. This makes it so easy when you're in Lightroom to just change the perspective of your image. All I have to do is go to transform and then hit guided, and it straightens the image, it fixed the perspective. I'll show you that again, and then I hit guided. So one of the most interesting things about the M10 Monochrom is its high ISO capability. Now on the ISO dial, you won't be able to go up to ISO 2500, 25,000. The ISO dial, the highest you can go is 12,500. So when you want to go beyond that, you'll have to go into your main menu and then click ISO setup, and then the ISO will show up here where you can click on that and scroll through all the different ISO options and pick whichever one you want. So that's how you'll get to 25 all the way up to 100,000. So being this is a Leica M rangefinder, everything you're going to need is on the top of the base plate here. Let's take a closer look at it. So you have your shutter speed dial, and next to that you have your power lever and the shutter button. Now on the far left of the top plate you have your ISO dial, which was something Leica started doing with the M10s, and it went all the way through to the M10 Monochrom and M10R, and now it's on the M11 as well. So having your ISO dial on the top plate is very helpful, rather than having to go into the menu and change your ISO all the time that way. So since you're dealing with light and shadow, you have to make sure to expose for the highlights. Not only that, you can set your exposure compensation down to -0.7 or 1 full stop. This will ensure that you'll get all the details in the highlights. Now when you do that, you're going to find that when you upload your image into Lightroom, you'll see information in the lights and the highlights that you didn't actually see on location. I find this happens a lot with my car photography, and it's always a pleasant surprise. The camera is pulling in so much information in these lights and highlights that you can't necessarily see with the human eye. It's quite interesting when you see it. Now everything right here in this section, had I not exposed for the highlights, this would have all been blown out. As you can see, the shadow's more over here, and then the lights are right here in this section. So I'll zoom in, and you can see all these details we picked up because I exposed for the highlights. So this is exactly what I was talking about, the logo. Then even here in the lights, all the detail in the chrome here. Pick up the shadow. See, if you don't expose for the highlights, you'll blow out, these fine shadows, and this would just be pure white. Even up here, you're picking up some shadow. Now, some of your highlights on a car, like in this area here, will get a bit blown out because of the sunlight, and it's just the nature of car photography. But you can see I still preserved a lot of detail in the highlights with this image. So here's another example. This car was yellow and white. Now obviously this whole section here, had I not underexposed, would have been blown out. You wouldn't have got these reflections in the paint. Also, you wouldn't have got all this detail here in the chrome. So you can see I picked up a lot of shadow and a lot of reflection, even in the windows here, the chrome here. You can see this shadow here goes all the way along, this highlight area. Then in the paint, all these fine reflections. It's really impressive. Now for this image, I really had to underexpose because the sunlight was coming here from about the upper right corner. And it was just pouring into the interior and on the chrome on the steering wheel here. And so I underexposed it by, I would say, at least 2 stops, or basically the entire interior dashboard was just black. You couldn't make out much. So the reason I had to do that is, as I say, the sun was just pouring in through the front windshield. And so you can see, since I underexposed, I got all this detail in the chrome on the steering wheel. This whole area would have been blown out had I not underexposed. So you can see all the shadow detail, even down to the fine scratches on the chrome. And you can see a lot of this here on the dashboard isn't pure white. It's kind of a nice grayish. Perhaps had I not raised the exposure as much in this image globally, and I just raised it for the darks and maybe raised it a bit globally, I would have probably even gotten more detail in this area. But based on the way I processed the image, it's not bad. I mean, even right in here, you can see this screw, rivet here, and the details there. And technically, this area is not even in focus, as you can see. The focus really ends somewhere in the middle or towards the end of the steering wheel. So since you always have to underexpose your images, shadow recoverability would have to be a must. And with the M10 Monochrome, pulling up your shadows isn't a problem. Let's take a closer look. So this car was underexposed about, I would say, a near 3 to 4 stops. So on the left side of the screen is the edit where I brought up the shadows. And this is, like I say, about 3 stops plus curve adjustments, raising the mids and the curves in Photoshop. And this is what I got. So you can see the huge difference between what comes out of the camera for the M10 Mono to what you can get after you edit. And let me show you all the details that are preserved after you raise up your shadows 3 to 4 stops. So you can see the detail here in the Chevy logo is intact. Let's go over here in this light, and obviously this section here of the car, this vent was way even more in the shadows than the rest of it because of the vent lips here. And then the lights are probably the most impressive. All the detail, you can nearly make out the name of the headlamp. So it's quite impressive. Also, I will say this was shot at ISO 160. So the results are even, this is really the optimal way to prove how good the shadow recoverability is when you shoot at a lower ISO rating. So here's another example of shadow recoverability. This is after raising the exposure and the shadows. Now obviously the sunlight was coming in behind the subject of these tree branches. And I'm going to zoom in. And you can see all the detail in the bark. So see what I mean? No detail at all. But then you raise the shadows and it's really impressive. So no, this camera does not have image stabilization, but it doesn't make a difference. Now, I wouldn't shoot at anything lower than 1/125th or 1/250th of a second. However, let's say I'm going out at night and I want to shoot at f5.6. Well, it's not a problem. I can shoot at f5.6 at 1/1000th of a second and put my ISO to 15 or 25,000, and I'm going to get usable images. So image stabilization, when you have such good ISO capability, it doesn't make a lot of difference, especially when you can go, as I said, down to 1/25th or 2/50th of a second. So the way I look at it, if image stabilization was needed in these higher megapixel sensor cameras, I don't think Leica would put out a 40 megapixel sensor in the M10R and the M10 Monochrom and then say we're going to put a 60 in the M11. They test these cameras, and if you couldn't get usable images, well, it wouldn't be a product worth putting on the market. Now, I understand if you're outside and it's cold and perhaps snowing, well, 1/250th of a second might not be enough. So you'll have to up it to maybe 1/500th or 1/1000th of a second in order to get sharp images. That is if you're shaking. So for me, image stabilization hasn't been a glaring issue. It hasn't been a problem at all. So the M10 Monochrom is for those of us who love monochrome photography. I think it's wonderful that Leica makes a dedicated monochrome sensor. They've done it with the M9 Monochrom and then the M-Type 246 Monochrom, and now of course the M10 Monochrom. I hope they continue to do it, but we'll see.